Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala amma ba'd. I want to welcome everyone here today. After a period of time, we haven't done our hadith narrations looking at the virtue of the Qur'an. So today we have a very special hadith, and this is hadith number 7 from our book. This is a hadith that's very special and it's very beautiful, and it kind of puts the Qur'an in perspective and the virtue of the Qur'an in perspective. And actually this is a hadith you can begin the entire collection with. I debated myself, should I begin this particular hadith, should I begin the entire 40 hadith collection with this particular hadith, or wait for this section? But in any event, we have it on this particular section. Now we're beginning a new series of narrations looking at the virtue of the Qur'an itself, the virtue of reciting the Qur'an. Previously we looked at the Qur'an and the virtue of the Qur'an from different perspectives. Now for the next several weeks, there's a number of beautiful narrations that tell us the intrinsic virtue of reciting the Qur'an. And we'll look at that in a little bit of detail. And this particular hadith begins that entire section. It helps us put the Qur'an in perspective. It's a hadith that's a comprehensive look at the effect of the Qur'an in our lives, basically. Our life from beginning to end, from the dunya to the akhirah, what the Qur'an has to do with it. There's a comprehensive look at that. And it teaches us the basic principle that our ultimate success is linked to the Qur'an. Our ultimate success in the next life is linked to the Qur'an. It's that simple. And there's two things we want to look at with this particular hadith. Just keep that in mind. This hadith is about what the Qur'an can do for you, and secondly, how to enjoy those benefits. So again, what the Qur'an can do for you, and what we need to do for the Qur'an. So Jabir ibn Abdullah, the companion radiallahu anhu, may Allah be pleased with him, he narrated that the Prophet said sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Al-Qur'anu shafi'un mushaffa'un wa mahilun musaddaqun man ja'alahu amamahu qadahu ila al-jannah وَمَنْ جَعَلَهُ خَلْفَهُ قَادَهُ إِلَى النَّارِ. The Prophet said that the Qur'an is a truthful intercessor on your behalf, or it's a powerful advocate against you. Whoever places the Qur'an in front of him or herself, it will lead him or her to paradise, and whoever places the Qur'an behind him or herself, it will lead him or her to the hellfire. We ask Allah's refuge from that. This hadith is not a very famous hadith. It's not found in any of the 6 books of hadith. It's found in the Sahih of Ibn Hibban, rahimahullah. Also Al-Bayhaqi in Shu'b al-Iman, he narrated this hadith. Al-Tabarani as well narrated this hadith. But the scholars who analyze hadith, they say it's authentic. Among them, Shaykh Nasruddin al-Albani from our times. So it's an authentic hadith, although it's not very well known. Now, what is the Prophet saying here? Again, the Qur'an is either a powerful intercessor for you or a powerful advocate against you. Whoever places the Qur'an in front of him or her, it will lead him to paradise, and whoever places the Qur'an behind him or herself, it will lead him or her to the hellfire. First of all, the hadith is talking about the Day of Judgment, the initial part at least. The Qur'an is shafi', intercessor, or an advocate against you. And it's talking about the Day of Judgment. Generally, when you look at the Day of Judgment, this is referred to as a single day in Islamic terminology. And generally, the language that is used and the style that is used, that this is a court of law. Okay, this is the language, this is the terminology that's used to refer to the Day of Judgment, the Day of Hisab, the Day of accountability. This is the most important day in any one of our lives. By far, more important than the day we were born, than any of the days, any of the things and milestones we go through. This is the day every human being will stand before their Lord. So it's a court of law. If you look at the verses of the Qur'an and everything the Prophet said about it, it's basically a court. And if you look at what a court is a legal proceeding. So you have different sides in a courtroom. You have a judge. That's the most important person. And then you have the person in front of him whose case is being decided, who is generally referred to as the defendant. So you have a judge and you have the defendant. And then that defendant himself or herself has a defense, and he has or she has a prosecution. The defense, their job, they're a group of people, lawyers or institutions, their job is to defend that person. And the prosecution, their job is to make the case against that person and to prosecute that person. And in the Day of Judgment, there's no jury. Jury is a modern concept that some nations use, but on that day, there's one judge, and that's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the judge of all judges, the king of all kings. There's the defendant, that's each and every one of us, and we'll have a separate session with him. And then you have defense and you have prosecution. You have lawyers working for you and some lawyers working against you. So what are these lawyers? The Prophet, he referred to them, he said that basically Al-Qur'an. The Qur'an is either going to be shafi' or mushaffar, or mahilun musaddaq. What do these words mean? Shafi' comes from the word shafa'. We all know the term shafa', intercession, right? So shafi' is a person who intercedes for you, who advocates for you. And mushaffa'un, it means, it's an adjective that this person or the Qur'an that's going to advocate for you, intercede for you, its intercession is accepted, mushaffa'un. So the Qur'an will be in your court on the Day of Judgment, but it will be on one of two sides. That's a powerful point. It might be in your defense, and it'll be a shafi', it'll be an intercessor for you. And we'll see other hadith in the next few weeks that talk about the Qur'an interceding specifically for specific groups of people in specific ways. But in general, the Qur'an can be your defense. And it's a truthful defense if you have it on your side. On the other hand, the Prophet said, وَمَاحِلٌ مُصَدَّقٌ. Mahil in the Arabic language is a difficult term. It's a term that means a lot of things. It comes from a word that means infertile or barren. Mahal refers to a severe drought where it hasn't rained for years. It can also refer to a land that's never had vegetation grown from it. So it has a meaning of severity, and it means something that's barren, that's fertile. Sometimes is used to refer to something that's very strong and severe. As Allah says, Wallahu Shadidul Mihal in the Quran, Allah is very stern in His punishment. So Mahil is used in many ways, but the meaning here, Mahil is a person, an opponent that's so dead set against you that they'll go to any means to prove their case against you or fight you. So it's an opponent, Qasim, Mujadil. That's what the scholars say. So it's an opponent that advocates against you. So basically the simple meaning is the opposite of shafi'. One is an advocate for you, the other is an advocate against you. Shafi' is one who intercedes on your behalf, defends you, makes excuses for you, presents your case in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Mahil, on the other hand, is the opposite of that. It's someone who makes the case against you. And it's a truthful. The Prophet used the term musaddaq. If the Qur'an becomes your mahil, which is your prosecution, it will be musaddaq, it will be truthful. It's not something made up. If the Qur'an is on that side, then you're doomed. We ask for Allah's refuge from that. So really, this is the whole point. In the Day of Judgment, the court of law, the Qur'an is going to be on one of two sides. And the Prophet said this in many occasions. He said this in another hadith that we're more familiar with, that's in Sahih Muslim, and it's also in the Arba'een, and a portion of that hadith, وَالْقُرْآنُ حُجَّةٌ لَكَ أَوْ عَلَيْكَ. The Qur'an is a proof for you or against you. We've all heard that hadith. So hujjah means, from this perspective, hujjah means a case, a proof, something that's already decided, done deal. So the Qur'an can prove your case for you, or it can prove the case against you. The Prophet was teaching the same principle. So really, this is what the Qur'an can do for you. So this is why this hadith deserves to be looked at before we look at other narrations, because the Qur'an can be on one of two sides, and it will be in our court, either in the defense or the prosecution, and we need to ask ourselves where we want the Qur'an to be. Now the second portion of the hadith tells us the methodology. How do we get there? How do we get the Qur'an on our side? How do we get the Qur'an to be our defense and not our prosecution? It's a very simple formula. So the first part of the hadith is talking about the akhirah. Okay. Second part of the hadith, the Prophet is talking about our lives in this world. And he said, مَنْ جَعَلَهُ أَمَامَهُ قَادَهُ إِلَى الْجَنَّةِ وَمَنْ جَعَلَهُ خَلْفَهُ قَادَهُ إِلَى النَّارِ. Whoever places the Qur'an in front of him, it will lead him to paradise. It's that simple. Whoever places the Qur'an behind him, it would lead him to the hellfire. So this is a comprehensive metaphor. You know, there are many things that could be said about the Qur'an. How do you get the Qur'an on your side? But The Prophet hit the nail on the head. He's used the most succinct language and so comprehensive. Putting the Qur'an in front of you or putting it behind you. So in other words, when he's teaching us that the position we enjoy in the hereafter is determined by the position we gave the Qur'an in our lives. It's that simple. Whatever position we gave the Qur'an in our lives is going to determine our position in the next life. And it's basically putting the Qur'an in front of you versus putting the Qur'an behind you. Now what does that mean? It's a very comprehensive term. It can mean many, many things, and it's pretty obvious. Everyone has a sense of what it means, putting the Qur'an in front of you versus behind you. But the scholars, nevertheless, they discussed the details, and there were a lot of things that were said. Putting it in front of you obviously would mean reading the Qur'an, it would mean believing in the Qur'an, it would mean turning to it for guidance, opening it again and again, making it a priority in your life, basically. That's the bottom line. Making the Qur'an a priority in your life, following His commandments, everything that the Qur'an deserves, you do it. Imam al-Nawawi, rahimahullah, he said, putting the Qur'an in front of you means to recite it and not to abandon it. To recite it and act upon it. So he put the definition as qira'ah, someone who recites the Qur'an and he lives by it. And it's a very beautiful and comprehensive way of looking at it. Imam al-Qurtubi, rahimahullah, he said, basically it means putting the Qur'an in front of you means that you fulfill all the obligations of the Qur'an and you avoid all the prohibitions of the Qur'an. That's another way of looking at it. But basically, if you look at all the different things that have been said about the Qur'an, in terms of the rights of the Qur'an, what we owe the Qur'an, they can all be summarized into 5 camps. And we'll just close with that. Number 1, believing in the Qur'an. That's the most important thing. That's the first level of our interaction with the Qur'an. Believing in the Qur'an, that includes iman and tasdeeq, affirming the Qur'an, believing that it's true, believing it's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and so on and so forth. That's the first level. The second level is reading the Qur'an. Second level is opening the Qur'an. It's a book, al-kitab, and reading it. And reading encompasses obviously reading it for spiritual benefit, which is qira'ah and tajweed and tartib. Also it means reading it for understanding, to understand the meaning. And that leads us to the third step, understanding the Qur'an. So believing in the Qur'an, reading the Qur'an. Thirdly, understanding the Qur'an. Understanding, there are different terms and there are different levels of understanding. Faham is one word that's used. Tadabbur is another word used in the Qur'an. Tafakkur also is used in the Qur'an, which is deep reflection. So it includes, learning the Qur'an, the meanings of the Qur'an, reflecting on it and acting on it. Number 4 is acting upon it. So believing in the Qur'an, reading it, understanding it. Number 4, practicing the Qur'an and living by it. Obviously, if you do all these 3 things, but you don't live by the Qur'an, then really your life tells a different story. And finally, the last level of interaction with the Qur'an is spreading it to others. So it's not enough to believe in it, read it, understand it, and live it in your personal life. You have to spread it to others. That's called tabligh, balagh. And this is something that the Prophet taught us again and again in Sunnah and in the verses of the Qur'an. So these are the 5 things that we owe the Qur'an. So putting the Qur'an in front of us obviously would mean all of these things. Believing in the Qur'an, reading it, taking the time to understand it, taking the time to live what it teaches us and live by the Qur'an, and finally spreading it to others. Now, conversely, let's take a brief look and we'll close with placing it behind you. Whoever places the Qur'an behind him or herself, it will lead him or her to the hellfire. What would that mean? Obviously, it's the flip side. It's the opposite. It would mean not reading it, abandoning the Qur'an. It would mean many, many things. Exactly the opposite of what the other side means. Now there's an interesting verse in Surah Al-Furqan, verse number 30, where the Prophet complained to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or Allah says that he will complain on the Day of Judgment, and he's going to say, وَقَالُ الرَّسُولُ يَا رَبِّ إِنَّ قَوْمِ اتَّخَذُوا هَذَا الْقُرْآنَ مَهْجُورًا. The Prophet will say, the Messenger will say to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, "Oh my Lord, my people, they abandoned the Qur'an." So the term he uses, hujran al-Qur'an, in this verse. And this is really what it means to put the Qur'an behind you, abandoning the Qur'an, hujran al-Qur'an, from the same word for hijrah, which means to move or leave a place. So this is something the Prophet will complain about on behalf of some of his people who rejected the Qur'an. And what does it really mean to reject the Qur'an, to abandon it, to put it behind you? Ibn Kathir rahimahullah, he says something, he has some comprehensive words and they're very beautiful, and I'll share with them and we'll end with that. He said basically abandoning the Qur'an. In his tafsir of this verse, he said it means many things, including not listening to the Qur'an. Like the Quraysh, they used to put their fingers in their ears when the Prophet used to recite the Qur'an. And many Muslims, they don't listen to the Qur'an. They don't take the time to listen to the Qur'an. And they make conscious decisions to avoid listening to the Qur'an. Also, leaving the pursuit of his knowledge. Ibn Kathir said, not pursuing the knowledge of the Qur'an, that's a form of abandoning the Qur'an. Leaving its memorization. People who don't memorize the Qur'an or don't take the time to memorize at least some portions of the Qur'an. He also said it means people who don't believe in the Qur'an and don't believe in what it contains, or they reject its message. That's abandoning the Qur'an. Also means not reflecting over the Qur'an, not thinking about what Allah sent you as in terms of the message, and not understanding the Qur'an. Also means not living by it. These are all the words of Ibn Kathir. He also said not fulfilling its commandments and prohibitions. If the Qur'an declares something prohibited or obligated, avoiding those. Not fulfilling the commands and the prohibitions, that's a form of abandoning the Qur'an. And finally he says, and this is something that should scare all of us, preferring other things to the Qur'an. And the words he used, he said, preferring other things to the Qur'an, such as poetry, such as music, and such as other ideas that people waste their time in. So we should ask, all of us need to ask ourselves, do we want the Qur'an on our defense or on our prosecution side? Do we want to put the Qur'an in front of us or behind it? Is the Qur'an open in our lives, or is the book closed and on our shelf? And we need to ask ourselves, are we giving priority to the Qur'an? That's really what this narration is teaching us. It's a beautiful narration. It teaches us the power of the Qur'an in terms of our ultimate success. And the formula is simple, giving a priority to the Qur'an. And let the Qur'an guide you. Whoever places the Qur'an in front of him or her, it will lead him to paradise, or her to paradise, and vice versa. So let the Qur'an be your guide. That's the message of this hadith. Let it take charge of your life. How do you do that? Obviously, many reasons, but at least begin by engaging the Qur'an. Engaging the Qur'an, opening the book, and developing a relationship with the Qur'an. And that's why we're here, all of us. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us among the people of Qur'an, make us among the people who keep the Qur'an at their forefront and not behind them, and make us among the people who on the day of judgment the Qur'an will be on their behalf, on their defense, and pleading and interceding on their behalf. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم